Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current status of my Sunday sermon. And let's go. Are you the center of the universe? One of the weird things in my strange YouTube life is that there are other people out there, and I do comments on their videos. And there's one guy out of England, his name is Stephen Woodford, and he has a channel called Rationality Rules, and he tends to do anti-Christian rationalist videos. And I made some comments about his videos over a year ago and hadn't really watched any of them. But then this video popped up, and so he kind of caught my attention because it was sort of a departure from his usual tactic, which is sort of that the world is a straightforward place of objects, and if we're all rational and follow rules, then we can save ourselves and everything will be grand. And he made a video that said when facts were not enough, and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And he mentioned the fact that 4 in 10 U.S. citizens or Americans are climate skeptics, and that's not surprising. And then he linked to another video that basically said that it was interesting that what is part of what is happening in this conversation is that it's not so much a question about facts, which is very much what Rationality Rules is about, but it's a question about psychology. Now you might imagine that, well, with all of the scientists saying that this is a bad thing, and a lot of the shrill, breathless admonitions from the media, and of course all the young people are on board, and politicians saying things like the world is going to end in 12 years, or all that stuff, you would think that all of these powerful tools that we generally use to shape public opinion would simply reshape the world. But what they're discovering is that it doesn't work. People aren't quite that able to be molded and to be shaped. And in that video, they had an illustration of a young man who attended a climate change rally with his friends, and all excited about climate change. But then one of the activists there wanted to talk him into becoming a vegan because vegans have less of a climate footprint. And what he says to them, he's kind of jokes and says, "I'm going to Subway and I'm going to eat meat." And the guy's trying to, cajole him and encourage him to not eat meat. And he says, "One day I'll die. One day I'll be dead." Now, what this young man has figured out is basically what the culture has been telling him, which is that just like before you're born, you don't have any memory. After you die, you don't have any memory. So what should you do in this world? Well, have as much fun as you can. Be the little center of the world. But this center of the world thing sort of cuts both ways. The situation gets worse. Now, I know there's going to be some people that are not climate change skeptics and others that are, and vast permutations. The point of this sermon is not to push you one way or the other, but, some of the facts on carbon dioxide are that even if the West and the United States drastically limit the amount of carbon they put out, those will be offset by China, India, and Africa, and and the populations that they will be having. And in fact, if you look at populations to the 22nd century, Africa is going to rival Asia in terms of number of billion people, even as North America, Australia, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Europe all sort of stay the same or reduce their population, and hence the amount of carbon that they put out. And so a lot of the panic and a lot of the fear is based on these numbers and these projections. But, well, I don't know. Most of us are older than this kid, so we'll be dead long before this kid, right? Well, the truth is that we have these big issues, and what these smart people on the internet say is that, well, with climate change, it's really a psychological problem, that the reason we don't care about climate change is the same reason the doctors tell us to eat a certain way and we don't, or exercise a certain amount of time and we don't, and a very small population does, but we're really lousy at taking care of ourselves because we're pretty much wired to take care of immediate needs, and long-term diffuse threats don't work. And each of us is sort of a little center of the universe, and we live this way because we really can't help it. Our often faulty systems of threat and opportunity detection are based on our immediate surroundings and of those we love. The whole planet could be going downhill, but if we or a loved one is in trouble, that's all we think about, and we'll do anything to rescue them. We live this way even though we know that there's a larger world and we should take care of it and perhaps, do so with spare money or energy or attention, but we're little centers of the world. And we actually can't help but be little centers of the world. Now, we've been going through Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, and we've seen Jesus as the master of this big world. Jesus is the master of the sea, and Jesus has authority over unclean spirits, and Jesus is sent to Israel, but shows compassion on the Syrophoenician woman. And now we have a little story that is neither in Matthew nor Luke, that, apparently if they wrote their Gospels after Mark, they didn't find anything in this story of much importance, and so they skipped it. But obviously Mark, perhaps following Peter, thought that this story was important, and it's a small story. We've had these huge stories of summary statements of Jesus healing everyone who came to him. But here's this story about one person. When he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee. Now, geographically, this makes no sense, so a lot of scholars believe that Luke has Luke and Acts, where you kind of get the whole picture of Jesus and the Gentiles, that the other Gospels often sneak it in subtle ways, and perhaps this is part of it. But he goes into the region of Decapolis, and they brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay hands on him. And so here, this deaf man and his infirmities, his limitations, his disabilities, might not have seemed like anything important in the grand scheme of things, but here they got a hold of Jesus, and his deafness and his inability to talk was certainly something that was robbing him of the kind of life that we assume God would want for him. So here's Jesus, and please lay hand on him. But Jesus took him aside in private. And this is where we see Jesus come into this man's personal space. And just pay attention how tender Jesus is with him. And this, whether this person was, related to Peter or for some reason this little vignette stuck out perhaps in Peter's mind of just saying something about Jesus' care for each of us as little centers of the world, the one who would still the sea. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, no show here, and he put his finger in his ears, because of course the man can't hear, and he's probably watching all this, and how could he have heard about Jesus, and what would he have learned? And so his loved ones brought him there, and again, if you're deaf, and all of this is confusion, and Jesus just, okay, it's your ears, and he spat, and that gets into some cultural confusion between our culture and their culture, and then he touched his tongue, and Jesus is basically, I'm going to make you well. I'm going to make you well, little center of the universe. And then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. One wonders how long he had been deaf. If he'd been deaf his whole life, would he have known spoken? It's just that there's just questions that arise. Then Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone, which is again amazing. Jesus is not running a political campaign where he's going to put this person up on stage and use this person for Jesus' fame. No, he takes him away in private. Teacher treats him with patience and tenderness, and opens his ears and frees his tongue. Jesus orders them not to tell anybody, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. It's just flowing out of them. They can't help but share this good news. And they were astounded beyond measure, saying, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Now, one of the most touching things that really captures my attention is this strange moment when, again, it's all these little details that we find in the Gospels that to me look like personal remembrances. This isn't why? And sometimes they seem so natural and so real because they're so unanticipated. So he looks up to heaven and then he sighs. Now this sighing, when you see something like this, obviously you say, well, what's going on with that? And so you do all this Greek work, and it's not an uncommon word, but it's an interesting word in this context. And of course I knew the word because it's in one of my favorite passages, Romans 8. And where the Apostle Paul talks about the creation having been subjected to bondage, but not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruit of the Spirit groan inwardly. That's the same word as this sigh. And you know that this word means sort of we can see the anticipation of the kingdom coming, but it's not here, and so we bear with patience the things that we must bear. I mean, that's what a sigh is, right? There was a situation once where my father, when he was young, would break everything in my grandmother's house just because my father didn't know his own strength, and he was so big and he was so strong, and my aunt would just goad him, and so he would break things. And once when I was in college, we were at my grandparents' condo, and my grandfather had this little stretchy exercise thing, but of course my father's very tall and strong, and so he takes the thing and he lifts it up all the way, and the thing breaks, and he smashes my grandmother's lamp. And my grandmother just looked and sighed. Here after how many decades, Stanley is still the same. And she just sighed. And so often when there's a burden that we must bear, we just sigh. And Paul has that there in the book of Romans, in Romans 8. And it's there in 2 Corinthians 2. For in this tent we groan, longing to be clothed in our heavenly dwelling. For while we are still in this tent, we groan under our burden, because we wish not to be unclothed, but to be further clothed, so that which is mortal may be swallowed up in life. And so here Jesus groans, even while he's ready to heal this man. Why? As I talked in last week's, maybe Jesus saw, how much more will have to be cleansed? How much more will have to be healed? How much more isn't there to restore? What will this take? Now, there are also in this passage sighs to Isaiah 35, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book of Isaiah. There's the particular, it's a very unusual word that's used in Mark here, and it's also used in Isaiah 35. And then the sighing is in Isaiah 35 too, and so many scholars have noted that here the Gospel of Mark seems to tie this to Isaiah 35. And Isaiah 35 is this wonderful passage of liberation and renewal and fulfillment. But you can't just jump to the Old Testament and just look at that. You should look at Isaiah 34, which is before it. Because every generation has their end of the world threats. And sometimes they're big and they're large and they're scary and they're frightening because they involve the whole world. But every individual person endures the end of their little center of the world. And that comes maybe with cancer or a car accident or a heart attack or a death. That Isaiah 35, which is a joyous celebration, is preceded by Isaiah 34, which is a passage about calamity and disaster, and God is the one bringing it. Draw near, O nations, to hear, O people, give heed. Let the earth hear and all that fill it, the world and all that come from it. For the Lord is enraged against all the nations and furious against all their hordes, and he has doomed them, has given them over for slaughter. Their slain will be cast out, and the stench of their corpses will rise, and the mountains shall flow with their blood. And you're like, well, this isn't the kind of God I want to think about. The hosts of heaven, all the hosts of heaven shall rot away, and the skies roll up like a scroll, and all their hosts shall wither like leaves withering on a vine, or fruit withering on a tree. When my sword has drunk its fill in the heavens, lo, it will descend upon Edom. Edom. Now Isaiah has as all of these prophecies from all of these different periods. Now Edom will, in many places in the Old Testament, be held up for particular judgment, because Edom, of course, comes from Esau, and Esau is Jacob's brother. And when the Babylonians came down, Edom should have stood with his brother, but instead Edom sided with the Babylonians and participated in the rape of Jerusalem. The Lord has a sword, and it is sated with blood. It is gorged with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the blood of kidneys and rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. In other words, the image here is that God is going to cut up Edom like a sacrificial animal. Wild oxen shall fall with them, and young steers with the mighty bulls. Their land will be soaked in blood, and their soil made rich with fat. Now, you might think, well, where's Edom, and what's Edom? Ever hear of Petra? That's Edom. And if you look at it, it might look like something in Utah. All of this rock and so little water and just a little bit of green, and it's desert. This oracle against Edom. But that, of course, then opens us up for Isaiah 35. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the majesty of their God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy. And he's come and he's doing these things. Then the lame shall leap like the deer, and the tongue of the speechless will sing for joy. For waters shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. The haunt of the jackal shall become a swamp. The grass shall become reeds and rushes. A highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. The unclean will not travel on it. Remember all those unclean spirits Jesus casts out? But it shall be for God's people. No traveler, not even fool, shall go astray. Even God's fools. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads, and they shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. But yet Jesus sighs. He sighs. So in Mark 6, taking 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves. Here he looked up to heaven and he sighed. Did he sigh knowing what this would cost him? Yes, he's freeing this man. He's freeing his tongue. He's freeing his ears. Hear him, you deaf. Hear him, you deaf. His praise, you dumb. 4,000 tongues to sing. That great hymn. And he sighs because he knows what it will take, because just the loosening of the tongue and the opening up of his ears is but the beginning. And the man has no idea. But Jesus knows. He sighs because he's not there. And he groans. Now this groaning is also the sound that rises up from the battlefield. And I listened to that World War I podcast, and it's the groaning of, it's just waiting. Can you rescue me? And this is the groans of earth. And the Spirit says we groan, we wait to be fully clothed, but we do so in hope. And the groaning and the sighing he does, because he will bear the burden. Now, C.S. Lewis in the 40s wrote Living in an Atomic Age, People were freaking out because the Soviets had the bomb, and of course the Cold War would come, and the world for the next 40-some years would live amidst the shadow of nuclear annihilation. And any minute, they could fall. There's still that threat. But then everyone was freaking out, and Lewis asked, "Did you forget what kind of world you're living in? Your little centers of the world are fragile, and whether it comes and a whole city gets destroyed by a nuclear weapon, or, how often don't people say it when the calamity strikes, my life ended that day." That's the world we live in. The big world and the little world are both fragile. I'll be dead one day. Yes, you will, but you won't be null. We care for this world and we care for each other whether or not we win in all the ways this world imagines we should. You'll make your own mind up about climate change. That's what people do. And at least another dozen threat that promises to destroy us. And most of us just don't think about these things for one reason or another in one way or another. But it comes sooner or later. I'll be dead one day, and so will you. But Christians live between two ages, the age of decay, where we can't hold on to anything, and the age to come, which Christians can't lose, because it's been secured by the one who looks up to heaven and sighs and bears the burden and carries his cross. Jesus heals this man as a sign in his age, in this age, pointing to the age to come of Isaiah 53. Go and do likewise.